Okay, got a handout for you. This is, well, we won't get all the way through this, and I haven't finished the last part of this. That's for next week. But I went ahead and put kind of the framework there. There's 3. Donnie, you'll have to come get this. I'm just kidding. Are y'all one? Are y'all? And what about the handout? Does Camille want one? Okay. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. No, I've got mine. Boom, boom, boom. One other prayer request I'm going to ask you about. Just keep this on your prayer. If you have a place to write it down, write it down. One of our young men that's graduating, that, man, I've known him since he was in the 3rd grade. And he's graduating from Austin East next week. Anyway, he was arrested Monday night. Knox County detention. So anyway, he's out now on bond, and I've been working with him this week. Spent a lot of time with him. Yeah, just very concerned about. Wayne and I were talking just now about. I just finished this big, huge, stupid paper. No, not stupid, but big, huge, hard paper on the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. And then, like the next day after I turned it in, Wayne walks in with this book and said, "Man, I just thought about this book. I saw this book and thought about you. This may be something." And one of the things that I put in the paper was that we've got to be more intentional about the fear of the Lord. And fear of the Lord is not our language. Okay, one of the things I ran into in reading and had to read like 50 different things, and one of the things you run into is everybody makes the disclaimer at the beginning that, oh, now fear, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be, you don't have to be terrified. You're not shaking in your boot, And I was like, well, yeah, you are. We just don't like that language. We don't like the thought of God scaring us. Okay? But it really and truly has something to do with that. At the end of the day, I defined fear of the Lord as God is in his place and I'm in my place. That's what at the end of the day it is, rather than just an emotion and those kinds of things, But so one of the things I put in the paper was that I was supposed to do at the end was, okay, so what do we do with this? And one of them was, man, need to be thinking about language. I mean, how do we say this, without, in our culture, fear of the Lord, that's what it sounds like it's coming. And so Wayne hands me this book the next day. Long story short, Wayne hands me this book, and it's got language for all this. He said, I ran across this and thought you might need it. It was such a God thing, And then I get a text that, this young man's in jail the next day. And I'm like, okay, get to apply it right now. Get to apply it in a real life situation. How do we do this? How do we say this, I went over to his house yesterday after he got home from jail, and I met him at the house. And, so how do we how do we say this? This is what I need to communicate to him, and was met with, and I'm not saying by people, but just the hardness of a culture, and the how much a culture has to change, around the idea of being arrested, being in jail, a lot of, not really, number one, it's no big deal, it's not my fault, and kind of had to get in face a little bit, but yeah, just be praying for that situation and praying for wisdom, wisdom to know what to do. Have a lawyer for him, got a public defender assigned to him. Leland, at some point, I was just going to ask you if you happen to know her. I'll ask you afterwards or something if you happen to know who she is. But anyway, just be in prayer about that. Okay, we're talking about the mission of God, is where we've been and where we're going to be going. And so you've got a handout there. And tonight we're making a transition from one topic to another topic within the mission of God. Remember, it's based on the writings of Christopher Wright, incredible author. I've got a kind of a reminder quote there at the beginning of it. Mission from the view of our human endeavor, from our viewpoint, means the committed participation of God's people in the purposes of God, not the purposes of themselves, okay? And the purposes of God for the redemption of the whole creation. The mission is God's, and it is a marvel that he lets us join in. You know, that's one of the statements that Christopher Wright makes. He uses people, just spoiler alert tonight, because we're going to go into the section now. We've been talking about the God of mission. Now we're going to talk about the people of mission. Okay, the ones who God brings in and calls and says, hey, be a part of this with me. I want you to be a part of this with me. And, you know, there might be some who were in God's counsel who might say, wait a minute, they're the problem. They're the whole problem. Why are you calling them to do that? And God says, just you wait. Watch these broken people. When I get hold of them. And when I do what I mean to do. And when my will is done in them. Watch what happens to this world. Watch what happens to creation. And so, yeah, let's remember real quickly, what is this mission? Once again, I've been looking for language. One of the reasons is I'm forced to look for language that I have to get graded on. But beyond all that, I want to find good language for this mission, you know. What is God up to? And kind of where I am right now. God, what is that mission? God's mission is a creation in which he lives completely and sustains life. He is present sustaining life in that creation, and that's a gift from him. He doesn't have to do it. It's a complete and total gift from him to sustain life and to keep life going eternally. And that he is fully known by that creation. It's impossible for God, I believe, to be present fully in creation, sustaining life perfectly, and not be known. You're going to know him then. And you're going to be fully known, okay, as well. One thing we need to remember about this mission that we've been talking about, and this is still the part that is hard for us to wrap our mind around, because we kind of come with a different framework, we kind of come with a different way of looking at it, is that heaven and earth in the Bible are talked about as interlocking and overlapping. Okay? We think, and really and truly part of it is natural. And it's been going on since Genesis. It's natural for human beings to look up, you know, God up there, you know. The Bible talks about the word heaven in two ways. Number one, the heavens, just the sky, the blue sky, where the birds fly, you know. That's one of the things. But the other place is where God lives. This is where God is. It's Tim Mackey says it's God's space, and I like that. I like the way he says that. God's space and our space is supposed to, and we catch a glimpse of it in Genesis 1 and 2. We catch a glimpse of what it's like when God's space and human space is like this. And it's a beautiful thing. Doesn't last long. Okay? Just two chapters. Okay? And then, I lied. There's a chapter or two at the end of the Bible that says it happened again. It's going to happen again. God's space and our space, and God's space comes down to us. Once again, our first thought is we go up. The Bible says he comes down. Okay, that's the only problem with the way we think. Is that the Bible says he comes down. And so God's space and this space is supposed to be like this, but is that the reality of this world that we live in today? Is it like that fully? No, and what's the reason? Sin. okay? And really even more fully than that, death. Death is the problem. Death is the break that keeps it. It's not fully, God didn't just go away and said, I'll be back, I'm going 20,000 miles away. When you get your act together, I'll come back. That's not, it still overlaps in some ways, okay? Think about 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 6. Got it written down. Yeah, 2 Kings chapter 6. Remember the story of Elisha? And he and his servant were there. The army of Aram was coming after him. And the servant said, man, we're dead. We're so dead right now. Look at all these people. Look at all these chariots. Look at all these horses. And Elisha said, don't worry, there's more of us than them. And Elisha's servant's going, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, you're crazy. And Elisha says, Lord, show him. And what do we see? God's space opens a curtain. And what's in the mountains surrounding? Army of chariots, an army of fire, an army of chariots of fire, and angelic beings are all there, okay? So in the Bible, we see this overlapping sometime. Transfiguration, right? Transfiguration. God's space opens up a little bit. And the apostles got to see Moses. They got to see Elijah. And they got to see Jesus looking like he's going to look, looking kind of God-spacey instead of earth-spacey for a few minutes, And so there's that there. But there also is, because of sin and death, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, there is a separation. And we think of it as up and down, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But as long as we know that it's not far away and there's nothing in between and nothing can be done, unless Jesus pops down here. And that one day we're going to jump over there and leave this. That's not what the Bible says. Okay? Deuteronomy 26 says, your habitation, God, is what? In heaven. In heaven. It's in this space. Okay? 2 Chronicles 6:21 says the same thing. So his space and our space is supposed to be overlapping, interlocking, and you can't tell one from the other. That's what we find in the Garden of Eden. You can't tell that. By the way, what was the space in Israel that represented God's space and our space? The temple and the tabernacle. And what was all over the inside of the temple and the tabernacle? Yeah, a garden. Sewn into the walls were trees and flowers and all these things. It was supposed to represent it like the Garden of Eden. It's supposed to be that. And this is the spot now. This is the spot where it happens. Okay, so anyway, God's mission is to be fully present, fully known, his space and our space, interlocking, and what flows out of that is eternal life. What flows out of that is perfect eternal life. And that's not where we are right now. We probably can all attest this week, or last week, or the last hour to some way that this world is wonky and wobbling. It's not right. Okay, so quick reminder where we are in class. There's 3 parts that we want to cover in this class, in the Mission of God class. We just finished the God of Mission. The focus has been, who is this God and what is he on? What mission is he on? Who is this God? And that's what we've been teaching here. Let's talk about a minute some of the things that came out of that. Who is this God? Over the last, about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something like that, Greg, Danny, Leland. Yeah. If you want to see God, take a look at Jesus. He was that the first thing he did? Adam and Eve went out of the garden and here comes Jesus. Is that what happened? Okay, no. But God's, we're going to look at a verse in a minute. God's unfolding plan. Paul talks about. It unfolds, and finally we reach the point where we unfold it, and what? There's Jesus. You want to see the Father? There he is. You know. So what else? Yeah, what else do we? There's some hard things about God that we looked at, and some awesome things. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, he revealed himself through Israel. Yeah. Through, man, people. There he is. There. Yeah. Yeah, God's a wounder. Do we think about that much? God is a wounder. And he's a healer. He's an exiler. And he's a bringer backer from exile. Okay? I know it's fancy words and all, but okay. But yeah, we like to think more about God as bring him home and all this stuff. But God told Habakkuk, put your hand over your mouth in disbelief about what I'm going to tell you. Habakkuk was complaining that evil people got away with stuff. And God said, clap your hand over your mouth and listen to what I'm about to tell you. Babylonians are coming to take you out of your land. Habakkuk's response is supposed to be, that's what he told him, go ahead and get ready, do it. Get ready. Okay? It's a beautiful and terrible and hard passage. Okay? And then he goes to talk to Habakkuk about idols and how crazy idols are. And Greg was talking to us about idolatry on Sunday and how humanity has struggled and continues to struggle with idolatry. And that the idols that he talks about in Habakkuk 2, that people have to shout at the idols so much. Why do they have to shout so loud at idols? Because they can't hear anything. Because they're deaf. And so people shout and scream and yell. And then what does God say? But the Lord is in his holy temple. All the earth keeps silent. And it's just beautiful poetry and beautiful images, one after another, of this God and his comparison. He's holy. He's a redeemer. Okay. By the way, redeemer. And we looked at the Exodus story, and God bringing the people out of Exodus. The things that I studied just recently is how when the Israelites got out of Egypt and crossed the land, they came to the Mount of Sinai. Did they see the fear of the Lord at Mount Sinai? Did they understand the fear of the Lord? Yeah, they saw it. I mean, fire. You know, God said to Moses, bring the people up. And what did the people say after they saw God's power and might and smoke and glory? Moses, why don't you go up there and we'll just stay right back here. We're cool right here. That's good. I mean, but like you said, Catherine, flip over 3 or 4 pages. What happened? They're making an idol, you know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that whole story is a beautiful story. Some other words that I just came up with as I thought in your notes here. Incarnated, we talked about Jesus. Relentless. God is relentless. He just refuses to give up. He refuses to quit on us, on his world, on his creation. And gracious. He's a pursuer. I was trying to remember the person who said that. It might have been C.S. Lewis. If you can't think of somebody that said something, C.S. Lewis is always an awesome guess. So it might have been C.S. Lewis. And then what we're going to talk about here as we get in this next section, he's a covenant keeper. God makes promises and he keeps them. He just won't. And one of the most beautiful passages in the whole Bible is hard for us to understand because we don't live in Abraham's time. But that story about, Abraham, and it's really and truly, it's a story of God's space opening up. And Abraham enters God's space, and God graciously enters Abraham's space. And he tells him to dig a trench, and he says, take these animals, cut them in half, and let the blood flow down into the trench. And in ancient, Greg, did you talk about this? Was it you or, I couldn't remember which one of you guys talked about this a little bit. But, such a beautiful story, because in ancient times, that's what they did to make a covenant. Helen and I were entering into an agreement. Helen and I entered into an agreement tonight, by the way. But we decided not to kill animals and let the blood flow down to the middle, because it's not that big of it. But each person was supposed to walk down the middle of the trench in the blood and have bloody shoes and bloody ankles and bloody calves, and say, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, then may this happen to me. May this be my blood. That was how you kept an ancient covenant. And so you expect in that story, Abraham's about to walk down this trench. But who walks down the trench? God does. God walks down that trench. That mind-blowing. This God is so humbly gracious to us, so relentless in his pursuit of us. Yeah. Yeah. We really could have spent like 4D weeks, you know. Yeah. And man, and just continuing to think and dig in that. One of the things, I was having this discussion with Mark the other day in his office. We were talking about, and he brought it up because we were both talking about some of the things we were studying and learning and those things. And he said, man, I just want to go back to my first 5 years of ministry and talk to people that I taught, you know. And I said, man, there are times that I wake up or that I stop and think about my first 1 or 2 years of teaching at Alabama Christian Academy in Montgomery, Alabama, teaching 6 Bible classes a day. And I want to go back to them and I want to say how sorry I am, you know. And one of the things is what you just said and what we've been talking about, that I can remember teaching that God is holy, here's the verse. God is love, here's the verse. And so here's some examples of when he's holy, and he comes out and he's holy. And here's some examples of when he's love. So sometimes he's love and sometimes he's holy. You can't be is two things. You can't, you know what I'm saying? That doesn't make any sense. In his holiness, his love shines. In his love, his holiness blasts to the world. Okay? That's harder to understand. That's harder to get around. But I think that's what we're trying to do in here, is trying to get around some of these things and trying to think through that in God's holiness, his holiness is an act of his love. His destruction of people, Mark preached about this 3 or 4 weeks ago, right? His destruction of Canaan is because he loves his creation so much. And I am not going to let you destroy what is mine. You've had anything stolen before? You know? And whether you have all kinds of options. Let's say you caught somebody breaking into your house. I mean, the option, you know, baseball bat to the head, gunshot, call the police. There's a range of options. Okay? But does anybody sit here and go, how could anybody be that crazy? How could somebody be that mad? Somebody broke into their house? God, just let it go. Does anybody feel that way about somebody breaking into your house? No, we don't feel that way. We don't feel that way at all. How do you think God feels about Ukraine and Russia destroying each other? And children being carried off. And some minister from Russia gets up and says, oh, I've adopted one of those children. They're in such a better place. Taken away from their family. How does God feel about the 20th century being the century in the history of the world that more people killed other people than any other century by triple? God is love. People would, well, that's God's holiness is what we need. No, we need His love, and we need His holiness. Holiness will clean it up, and love will clean it up at the same time. So, anyway, yeah, just things like that. We have to, and Danny, you just used the word deeper. It's a deeper place, and it reflects Scripture so much better than me bringing my little thoughts to it. You know what I'm saying? So we've got 2 more parts to go in the class, halfway down the first page. The people of God's mission, and then we're going to look at the arena. Where does God's mission take place? It takes place in creation, okay? But we're going to look at what that means, okay? God's mission doesn't take place in some far-off place. It takes place in Knoxville, Tennessee. It takes place when justice is being done. God's mission takes place when Leland is standing and saying, this isn't right. Justice must be done. Okay? It's in this church. And by the way, at the end of this class, the whole purpose of this class is not for us to know some more about God's mission. The whole purpose of this class is to lead this group of people, and by God's grace and help, to a bigger group of people in this church. What is God up to here? Not what do we want to do. I just really like doing stuff like this and stuff like this. Okay. But before we do that, let's ask the question, what is God up to here? Okay? What is God doing in this community, in this neighborhood, in this place, through our sphere of influence, or even in places where we don't yet have influence, that need to be infiltrated with the gospel? Okay? What is God up to? I'll tell you one thing God's up to. Delinda, what's God up to in this place? Healing trauma, right? Man grabbed it, took it. Because we've got to heal. Part of being God's people of mission, we're going to talk about, is we're really broken. Really, really broken. We have got to get rid of this pretense of church that we have, that we're together in any way. We've got to. For the sake of the world, for the sake of us, we don't. We are not the people here that people can look at and go, wow, there's what it looks like. We are people who are broken. But we are people who have something that people who don't have Christ have. This sustaining life has been put in us. That's been put in us. And that's why, and the only reason why, that we can, when God says to us, come here, my mission needs a platoon. So go do that. And we follow His orders in mission. Follow His orders. We don't go make up our own battles, go make up our own stuff. We follow His orders. So here we go. That was way too long. I'm sorry about that. So the people of mission, down at the bottom of the page. Let's just do a spoiler. Let's just go ahead and spoil the whole thing. Let's spoil the ending. Go over to Ephesians 3:10. And, you know, I think it's good to look at the end. You know, and this is not really the end, but this is a great explanation of what it means to be the people of mission. But we've got to go back and do a lot of work before this too. But Ephesians 3:10, Paul says, beginning in verse 7, he's just been talking about the gospel. Of this gospel, I become a servant according to the gift of God's grace that was given to me by the working of his power. Boy, there's a whole big story packed in that sentence, isn't there? Good grief. I have become a servant. You know, in a very powerful way, you became a servant. Although I am the very least of all the saints. Yeah, Paul, you probably are where you started. You know, but he always sees himself that way. This grace was given to me to bring to the nations, the Gentiles. Man, sometimes we just need to remember that word Gentiles is the Greek word for nations. Okay? Sometimes we think it's a certain group of people. You know, a big group, this is a big group, and it's the nations. Okay? In the Greek, it's ethnos. We get ethnicity. We get all those words, you know. To bring the Gentiles the news of the boundless riches of Christ. And to make everyone see what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages. Here comes this unfolding kind of thing. To make everyone see what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things. He embeds this, Danny just talked about it, in God who created all things. Everything came from him. So what came from him? Jews came from him. The nations came from everything. Creation is inclusive, okay? So that through the church, the wisdom of God, my Bible says, in its rich variety. What does your version say? Huh? Manifold, yeah. That's usually the most common one. In its rich variety, or in it, God, his manifold wisdom, his unfolding wisdom. Be made known to Tacoma Drive, right? To God's space. To the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. Did you know that you're already in heaven? Paul says we are to make known. How could we make known to beings in heaven God's plan if we are not there? Paul is also going to say in Ephesians, you are now seated with Christ in the heavenly realms. He doesn't say one day you'll be seated with Christ. It's going to be awesome. He says you are now seated with Christ in the heavenly places, in the heavenly realms. Okay? And there's a reason why. We're going to get to that next week. That's what we're going to talk about next week. That's why I read that. Because we're going to talk about, man, how are we there? Wait, I thought we were dead, dead and all that. We're going to talk about that. But, so what's God's plan? What's God's intention? Who does God mean to show off him to the world and to the heavenly places? The church. We ought to really pay attention to that. When people say, man, I don't really need the church. Me and God, we're cool. We just got it, me and him. Well, the only problem with that is that God's intention was for the church to do that and for you to be a part of that community and for you to be in that. Because love can really, love has a hard time showing itself by itself, right? Love has a hard time. I have a hard time loving just standing here by myself. What do I have to do? I have to have someone to love. You guys, God, all those things. So God's intention was that the church, okay, be made known. So here's the questions we're going to ask. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I don't often do this, but I just really felt compelled for us to read these I'm going to read out loud these two handouts on the second page, and I'll tell you about them in just a second. But let's first of all, on the bottom of the first page of the handout, this is where I wanted to get to tonight. Here's the questions that we want to answer next week. And by the way, Christopher Wright doesn't really address this. This is why I wanted to do this before we get into the covenant and the church and those things. So the first, let's be reminded of God's intention when he made people. What is the goal of a person that God made? What did he have in mind when he made a person? We're going to look at that. What are people meant to be? What is a fully human human? Okay? We catch a glimpse, don't we? In Genesis 1 and 2, we catch a glimpse of fully human humans. Doesn't last long. Look quick. Okay? Because everything just goes, it falls apart after that. And there's a reason why it falls apart. But first of all, let's go back to that 1 and 2 and let's look for a few minutes. Let's look at 3 or 4 verses there. What is a human meant to be? Okay? But what we know is that people became less than they were meant to be. And I think the best way to put it that I heard somebody put, we reached for more and we ended up with less. Okay? People became less than they were meant to be. We're going to look at how, why, and what way. Okay? Next week. And so then what is a person if we're not who we're supposed to be, and the word, the most common word you'll find anywhere is broken, we're broken. But really and truly, that's not the best. There's a better description in the language the Bible uses, that Genesis uses, and we're going to look at that. The best description, and it is broken, is that we're split. We've been split, kind of in two. And so we're going to look at that in Genesis, okay? And so this week and next week, that, and then we're going to go on and we're going to talk about the covenant in the church, okay? So the back page right there of that handout that I haven't filled in yet, that's where we're going to be, but I just gave you some topics that we're going to be doing next week. Now, for the last few minutes, and this is hard for us to do, but man, I just really hope we can kind of focus. Instead of praying scripture tonight, I just want to read this. The first one, concerning the Christian way of seeing. That's the one I'm on. And then the second one is C.S. Lewis. This one, just finished reading this book this week. I took a whole day off for my paper, and then I have 5 books to read for my next class in 4 weeks. And so I read my first one. I picked up the shortest one and the smallest one. I just said, man, right now I need short and small. There was one that looked like that, and I was like, that will be the last one. That will definitely be the last one. But I could not believe a little profound book. It's called From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And it's calling for the church to move to we're not the dominant thing anymore. Did American culture used to be centered around the church? Did it? Yeah. How do you see that? You see church buildings in the middle of towns, and you see, it used to be that the stores were closed on Sunday. Why were they closed? Because people were worshiping, That's what this guy's calling Christendom. Christian just permeated the culture, and even if you weren't a Christian, you respected the fact that I'm not going shopping today, Because that's what you do. I mean, do you find that today? No, you don't find that. He said what he's calling for in this book is we've got to go back to the apostolic mission, where we're the minority. How does the church confront culture as a minority? We have the minority views. Okay? And by the way, one of his answers, he says, we do not join the right party in America. That's not what the church is called to do. He said, I'm not saying there won't be good things that happen, but that has nothing to do with Christianity at all. And so there's some challenging parts of it. But listen to what he says here. And if we'll I'll try to read kind of slow, because this is really powerful. Christianity is the most shockingly momentous view of what it means to be human that has ever been seriously believed or pursued. The weight of this momentousness is both thrilling and terrifying. Much of the modern flight from Christianity, when it does not stem from boredom, with a watered-down conventional version of the faith, is precisely a flight from the seriousness of existence of the heart of the Christian vision. That a lot of people are leaving Christianity because when you're faced with Christ, what did the rich young ruler do when he was faced with Christ? What did a lot of people do when Jesus said, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood"? That'll be it for me, thank you. When you're faced with the call of Christ and what it is, what it truly is, not some watered down version that a church here or a Christian there has presented. But when you're faced with it, that some people are leaving from boredom and some people are leaving because, nope, that's going to demand from me. That's going to take from me. That's what he says there. In the Christian vision, to be a human is to be involved in an extraordinary adventure. The greatest adventure stories ever written are only echoes of it, pale shadows of what the lowliest human is in truth undergoing. This drama began before we were born and will continue after we die, and each of us has been given a unique role to play in it. An integral aspect of this drama is that we have been born into an invisible world as well as a visible one. Okay? That's what we're saying about the interlocking. And the invisible world is incomparably more real, more lasting, more beautiful, and larger than the visible world. The only way that someone can say something like what Paul said when he wrote to the Philippian church, he said, what did he say? I really just as soon go be with Christ. I'd really just soon die and go be with Christ. But if I'm here, I get to continue working for Christ. But it'd be so much better. The only way you can say something crazy like that is if this is true. There is an invisible world, and it is so much more real than the visible world that there's no comparison. That's what he's saying there. Okay. That's why Jesus can say something crazy like, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Because there's a bigger world. There's a bigger existence. These people are bigger than soldiers hammering nails in people's arms. They're bigger than that. There's more to them than that. That's what he's saying there. An integral aspect of this drama is that we have been born into, well, I already read that. Our blindness to that world, that invisible world, represents much of our predicament. We are caught by the illusion of the merely seen, and we really need to have our blindness cured. This drama involves us not only with the awful and marvelous and incomprehensible being of God, who created us with a decisive purpose in mind, but also with a cosmic struggle among creatures of spirit more powerful than we are, who influence human life for both good and evil. We're living in a world full of the invisible around us, he says. We have been born into a battle, and we are given the fearful and dignifying burden of choice. We need to take a side. Every human has been created for a magnificent destiny. That the greatest prizes of this world seem like uninteresting, take it in. Not only are we meant to know good things, happiness, strength, length of existence, but we have been created to experience the unthinkable, to share in the very nature of God, to become, in the language so beloved by the Eastern Christians, divinized. Created from the passing stuff of this material world. What did he just say? From dust we came. We're created from the passing stuff of this material world, fused with an invisible and an immortal soul. Genesis puts it this way, and God breathed into male and female. They became a living being. So in Genesis, we're going to look at next week, what's a human? Dust and breath. the breath of God. That's what a human is. That's what Genesis says. We need to remember both parts of that. And that's what he's saying. It's what he's saying in this sentence. We are each of us meant to be what we would be tempted to call gods, creatures of dazzling light, strength, beauty, and goodness, sharing in and reflecting the power and beauty of the infinite God. Yet our destiny is at great risk. Had it not been for the intervention of God himself in our history, by a shocking act of humility and love, our divine destiny would have been lost to us by our own pride and rebellion. Individually and as a race, we had sustained a mortal wound. We're going to die. And we did die. Adam and Eve, we're going to look at next week, did die on that day, and then they were destined to die, because there's more than one way to look at death. They died on that day, because what did God say to Adam? On the day that you eat of it, you will die, right? So did Adam and Eve took the fruit? We didn't die. God was like, oh man, I messed that one up. I thought for sure they would. Is that what's going on? No, there is a death at that moment. And it ignited a long line that led to what we think of all the time as death. But it started way back here on that day. That's what he's saying there. Individually as a race, we had sustained a mortal wound and forfeited our original purpose, becoming enslaved to evil spiritual creatures. You become enslaved, what's the answer? To be redeemed. Redeemed is a slave word, freedom from slavery word. So we became enslaved, so we needed redemption. The evil spiritual creatures who themselves had turned their backs on the goodness of light of God and become deformed and filled with malice. That's a good description of humanity. That's a pretty good description of humanity. Let's look at C.S. Lewis real quick, then we'll go. I won't stop as much on this one. Anybody ever read this one? This is a pretty famous one. The other one, probably 20 people have read. But this one is worldwide famous. It's a talk that he gave to the British public on radio in the 40s, and then he wrote it down into an essay, and then he expanded it into a book. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption that as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or another of those destinations. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another. All friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom you joke with, work with, marry, snub, exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play. But our merriment must be of the kind, and is in fact the most merriest kind, that exists between people who have from the outset have taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner. No more tolerance, no mere tolerance or indulgence, which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, that's in Catholic terms, and the Lord's Supper, what we call the Lord's Supper. Your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy. in almost the same way. For in him also Christ, the glorifier and the glorified, glory himself is truly hidden. Wow. There's a human. Right? What people have said. Now, next week I'd like to go and look at some texts in Genesis that describe this. Genesis does it in its own way, but it says it. And we get a glimpse of what a fully human is supposed to be, a fully put together human. Just like heaven and earth are supposed to be this, a human is supposed to look like this. Dust and the Spirit of God, fully integrated. Okay? And what happened in Genesis 3? Ripped apart. We're struggling with it. And the word is death. We're going to look at what the word death means. It's really ripped apart, but this is dead. But is that the end of the story? No. Who are we today sitting in this room? We are people who are learning how to do this again. Learning to get comfortable here. Sometimes we kind of push and shove on God and say, no, that's a little uncomfortable. I like to have that part. Why don't you go down there like that? Stay there. And God keeps saying, nope, I want to do this. And one day, what are we going to look like? This. We're going to look like this. Okay? So, that's so important as we go into the rest of the story of the people of Mission. We need to understand who we are. We need to understand, and then we begin to understand how God is working with people in covenant, in the church, in calling people like Abraham and Noah and all these people. We need to understand who they are. So, does that make sense? Questions, comments, smart marks? Okay, I'm done. Thank you so much for being here.